Jessica Carpenter was a vibrant 22-year-old nursing student with an infectious smile and a heart full of dreams. She lived in the quaint town of Willow Creek, a place where everyone knew each other and life moved at a slower pace. Jessica was the kind of person who lit up any room she walked into. She was deeply loved by her family and admired by her friends for her dedication to her studies and her unwavering kindness. Jessica had recently taken on a part-time job at a local diner to help pay for her tuition. Her days were busy, but she always found time to call her mother, laugh with her younger brother, and reassure her father that she was handling everything just fine. And on the evening of November 12, Jessica finished her shift at the diner as usual. Her coworkers recalled her cheerful goodbye and how she had mentioned plans to study for an upcoming exam. She left around 8:30 p.m., walking briskly to her car in the parking lot. It was a chilly night, and the streets were quiet. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet, that was the last time anyone saw her alive. When Jessica didn't return home that night, her parents immediately knew something was wrong. She was responsible to a fault and would always call if she were delayed. Her father, Robert Carpenter, drove the familiar route from the diner to their home, hoping to find her car on the side of the road with a flat tire or some other minor inconvenience. But the roads were empty, and there was no sign of Jessica. By morning, her family contacted the Willow Creek Police Department. Officers initially treated the situation as a case of a young woman who might have stayed out late or decided to visit a friend without informing anyone. But Jessica's parents were adamant. This was completely out of character. As hours turned into a full day with no word from Jessica, the case was escalated and a search effort was launched. 2 days later, police found Jessica's car abandoned on a remote stretch of road a few miles from town. The vehicle was locked, and her purse, phone, and keys were still inside. There were no signs of a struggle, but the eerie placement of the car, far from any major routes or her usual path, raised immediate concerns. Search teams combed the surrounding woods, calling out Jessica's name, but the dense forest yielded no answers. As news of Jessica's disappearance spread, the small community of Willow Creek was gripped with fear. It wasn't the kind of place where people went missing. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted shut. Parents began escorting their children everywhere, and speculation ran wild. Rumors swirled about strangers in town, late-night arguments, and potential sightings. Jessica Carpenter, the young woman with so much ahead of her, had vanished without a trace. The question on everyone's mind was the same. How could something so tragic happen in their peaceful little town? As investigators delved deeper into Jessica Carpenter's life, they began uncovering details that painted a more complicated picture of her world. On the surface, Jessica was a dedicated nursing student, a loving daughter, and a reliable employee. But as they spoke to her friends, co-workers, and acquaintances, cracks in that perfect image began to emerge. One of the first revelations came from Jessica's best friend, Megan. She told police that Jessica had been in a tumultuous on-and-off relationship with Caleb Reed, a 25-year-old mechanic in town. Caleb had a reputation for being hot-tempered and controlling, and Megan claimed Jessica had confided in her about growing fears over Caleb's possessiveness. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Jessica had expressed her intention to end things with him for good, but she was apprehensive about his reaction. Megan believed Caleb's jealousy could have escalated into something dangerous. Adding another layer to the investigation, Jessica's co-workers at the diner revealed an unsettling detail. In the last month, Jessica had mentioned feeling like she was being followed. She described seeing the same dark SUV parked near her workplace several times, often lingering long after her shift ended. At the time, she had brushed it off as paranoia, but now the police began wondering if this vehicle was connected to her disappearance. Surveillance footage from a gas station along the route Jessica would have taken that night provided a chilling lead. In the footage, Jessica's car could be seen driving past, followed closely by a dark SUV. The timestamp aligned perfectly with her disappearance. Investigators now had a vehicle of interest, but identifying the owner proved difficult. No one in the area came forward to report seeing anything suspicious, and the vehicle's license plate was not visible in the footage. The investigation also turned back to Caleb Reed. He was brought in for questioning, and while he appeared cooperative, his answers were evasive. Caleb claimed he hadn't seen Jessica in several days and had been home alone the night she disappeared. However, he struggled to provide details that could corroborate his alibi. Police searched his home and garage but found nothing that directly tied him to Jessica's disappearance. Despite this, his history of jealousy and the nature of their relationship made him a prime suspect. Jessica's family, meanwhile, was grappling with an unbearable mix of grief and uncertainty. They participated in every search effort, hoping for a miracle. Flyers with Jessica's smiling face were plastered across Willow Creek, and local volunteers combed through forests and abandoned buildings, refusing to give up. The discovery of her car only deepened their despair. As days turned into weeks, whispers began to circulate in the community. Some speculated Caleb's involvement, while others believed a stranger had targeted Jessica. There were even rumors that her disappearance might be connected to other unsolved cases in the region, though police found no evidence to support this theory. With every new lead, the case seemed to grow more complex. Was Caleb hiding something? Was the dark SUV a critical clue, or a mere coincidence? As tension in the town mounted, investigators knew they were racing against time to find answers. 2 weeks after Jessica Carpenter's disappearance, the case took a grim turn. A hiker exploring the dense woods on the outskirts of Willow Creek stumbled upon a shallow grave partially obscured by fallen leaves and overgrown brush. The hiker immediately contacted authorities, and within hours the area was swarming with police and forensic teams. The discovery confirmed the community's worst fears. Jessica had been found, but she was no longer alive. Jessica's body was in a state of decomposition, yet certain details stood out immediately to investigators. Her wrists were bound with a cord, and there were visible signs of bruising around her neck, suggesting strangulation. The positioning of her body and the effort to conceal it indicated that this was no random act of violence. Whoever had done this had taken deliberate steps to hide their crime. The forensic team meticulously documented the scene, gathering soil samples, collecting fibers, and noting every detail that might lead to the killer. A cigarette butt was found just a few feet away from the grave, and it was carefully preserved for DNA testing. Jessica's body was transported to the medical examiner's office for a thorough autopsy, which revealed more chilling details. Jessica had fought for her life. There were defensive wounds on her hands, and traces of foreign DNA were found under her fingernails. This suggested she had scratched her attacker in an attempt to escape. The cause of death was confirmed as strangulation, and the estimated time of death placed it within hours of her disappearance. This meant that Jessica had likely been killed the same night she went missing. The discovery of her body sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. What had once been a case of hopeful searching now turned into a homicide investigation. The town mourned the loss of one of its own, and a sense of unease gripped the community. Jessica's friends and family were devastated, but they remained resolute in their demand for justice. Candlelight vigils were held in her honor, with hundreds of residents coming together to pay their respects and show their support for the investigation. Detectives immediately began analyzing the evidence recovered from the crime scene. The cigarette butt was sent to a lab for DNA analysis, and the results yielded a surprising lead. The DNA belonged to a man named Victor Hayes, a drifter with a long criminal history who had been passing through Willow Creek around the time of Jessica's disappearance. Victor was known for petty crimes and violent tendencies, and his presence in the area raised significant suspicion. Victor was quickly tracked down and brought in for questioning. He claimed he had no knowledge of Jessica or her murder, but his story was riddled with inconsistencies. He admitted to being in the woods, but claimed he was simply camping there. When confronted with the fact that his DNA was found at the scene, Victor stumbled over his words, offering vague and contradictory explanations. Despite this promising lead, the case was far from closed. While Victor's DNA placed him near the crime scene, there was no definitive evidence linking him to Jessica's murder. Investigators began to wonder if Victor was the killer, or if he had stumbled upon the grave and inadvertently left traces behind. The mystery deepened, and the search for answers became even more urgent. The case seemed to hinge on Victor Hayes, the drifter whose DNA was found at the crime scene. Investigators dug into his past and discovered a disturbing pattern of behavior. Victor had a history of violence, including a prior conviction for assault. He had also been implicated in a missing person case years earlier, though no charges were ever filed. His transient lifestyle made him hard to track, but his presence in Willow Creek at the time of Jessica Carpenter's disappearance was undeniable. As detectives interrogated Victor, they noticed his demeanor shifted frequently, from calm and composed to agitated and defensive. He continued to deny any involvement in Jessica's murder, insisting he had only been camping in the woods and had no idea how his DNA ended up at the scene. His claims didn't align with the evidence, but the lack of direct proof tying him to the act of murder posed a challenge. Meanwhile, investigators revisited the evidence they had collected. Jessica's journal, discovered in her room early in the investigation, became a critical piece of the puzzle. The entries detailed her growing anxiety over Caleb Reed's erratic behavior. Jessica wrote about Caleb's increasing possessiveness and a chilling threat he had made during one of their arguments. She mentioned feeling trapped and afraid, but didn't elaborate on why she hadn't ended the relationship sooner. Caleb's alibi for the night of Jessica's disappearance was flimsy at best. He claimed he was home watching television alone, but phone records painted a different picture. His phone had pinged off a tower near the woods around the time Jessica was presumed to have been killed. This new evidence cast a glaring spotlight on him, and investigators began to consider the possibility of multiple people being involved in the crime. It rested with the clinic to whether they believed that Jessica was involved in the crime. Adding to the complexity, a second cigarette butt was discovered during a deeper search of the crime scene. DNA analysis revealed it didn't belong to Victor, but instead matched Caleb Reed. The discovery raised a troubling question. Had Caleb and Victor crossed paths, or had they acted together? Victor's history as a drifter meant he often relied on odd jobs for money, and police learned he had done mechanical work for Caleb just weeks before Jessica disappeared. While there was no evidence of a close relationship between the two men, the possibility that Caleb had hired Victor for something sinister couldn't be ignored. As the pieces began to fall into place, investigators started to theorize that Caleb might have orchestrated Jessica's murder. His controlling behavior and proximity to the crime scene were damning, but Victor's involvement complicated the narrative. It was possible Caleb had used Victor to carry out the crime or help dispose of the body, leveraging his desperate circumstances and transient lifestyle to deflect suspicion. Detectives faced mounting pressure to secure arrests. Jessica's family and the community demanded justice, but the case remained tangled in a web of circumstantial evidence and unanswered questions. The investigation pressed forward, but the truth felt more elusive than ever. The investigation into Jessica Carpenter's murder reached a critical turning point when detectives re-examined the timeline of events and the connection between Caleb Reed and Victor Hayes. Caleb's phone records, DNA evidence, and Jessica's journal painted a damning picture of his involvement. But questions lingered about Victor's role. Detectives were determined to untangle the web of lies and manipulation that surrounded the case. The discovery of Jessica's journal entries became pivotal. In one of the final entries, Jessica detailed a chilling encounter with Caleb just days before her disappearance. She wrote that Caleb had cornered her outside the diner after her shift, accusing her of seeing someone else. He warned her that leaving him would come with consequences. Jessica expressed fear in her writing, describing Caleb's escalating anger and how it left her feeling trapped. This revelation solidified Caleb as the primary suspect, but police still lacked direct evidence placing him at the scene of the crime. That changed when detectives uncovered surveillance footage from a hardware store near Caleb's house. On the day before Jessica went missing, Caleb was captured purchasing a roll of cord that matched the bindings found on Jessica's wrists. The receipt from the purchase, found in Caleb's garage during a search, further corroborated his involvement. With mounting evidence, Caleb was brought in for a second round of questioning. This time, his story began to crumble. When confronted with the journal entries, phone records, and the hardware store footage, Caleb became visibly agitated. He eventually admitted to meeting Jessica on the night she disappeared, but insisted her death was an accident. He claimed they had argued in the woods, and in a moment of rage, he pushed her, causing her to fall and hit her head. He maintained that Victor Hayes was not involved, but his story failed to align with the forensic evidence. Victor Hayes, meanwhile, continued to deny any connection to Jessica's murder beyond being in the vicinity of the woods. However, investigators discovered that Caleb and Victor had been in contact more than once. Bank records revealed Caleb had made a series of cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to Jessica's disappearance, amounts that aligned with payments Victor had received from Caleb. Detectives theorized that Caleb had enlisted Victor to help dispose of Jessica's body, exploiting Victor's transient lifestyle and criminal history to shift blame if necessary. Under pressure, Victor eventually admitted that Caleb had approached him the night Jessica disappeared, asking for help in covering up a mistake. Victor claimed Caleb offered him money to dig a grave in the woods, but he denied any involvement in the actual murder. While Victor's role as an accomplice became clearer, his statements further incriminated Caleb as the mastermind behind the crime. Caleb Freed was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, while Victor Hayes faced charges of accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. The trial was a media spectacle, with Jessica's family attending every session, seeking justice for their daughter. Caleb's attempts to shift blame onto Victor failed, as the evidence against him was overwhelming. In the end, Caleb was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and Victor received a 15-year sentence for his involvement. The heartbreaking case of Jessica Carpenter left a permanent scar on Willow Creek, a grim reminder of the darkness that can hide behind familiar faces. For Jessica's family, the verdict brought some closure, but the pain of her loss would never truly fade. Jessica's memory, however, lived on in the hearts of those who loved her, a symbol of resilience and the pursuit of justice.